At Spoken with Authority, it is not uncommon for one of our coaching clients to get asked to participate in a media interview. We work with leaders and thought leaders, and this is a common occurrence. And a lot of our clients don't know how to approach those opportunities. I'm Christine Clapp. I'm here today with my colleagues, Lynne and David, to talk about how you can approach opportunities for earned media, meaning a journalist comes to you to ask for your expertise or your person on the street experience. And those opportunities are earned and not paid, meaning you aren't paying for an advertisement or paying for placement in that publication or in that online or broadcast source. To get our conversation started, I want you to hear, first of all, from my colleagues about why they're amazing experts. I think they have a great balance of expertise, both from Lynne, who trains, teaches, and she has produced on-air talent, and David, who has served as a commentator, and he is on-air talent. So I would love for you to give a little bit more about your expertise and why our clients should trust the advice that you're providing today.
I guess I'll start.
Thanks, Lynne.
I have 30 years experience in broadcast news. I did both undergraduate and graduate degrees in broadcast news. And then after that, I moved to teaching graduate broadcast journalism students for 18 years. I've also worked with other clients in some sorts of coaching engagements and with their organizations or individually for how to present in different ways. And that would include people who are in the government service or not-for-profit organizations or beyond. It's important to recognize the value of how you present in an authentic way to people so that they trust you.
Thanks, Lynne. And thanks for sharing your expertise. David, tell us about your experience.
Absolutely. I'm a CNBC contributor, and I get called to appear on MSNBC and the NBC networks relatively often these days. It's been super cool. I've been a lawyer for about 21, 22 years now. I've tried about 80 cases to a verdict in different capacities. I do civil rights law 100% of the time now when I'm practicing law. I'm also a speaker and coach with Spoken with Authority. Civil rights is a hot topic. And so I started getting called a couple of years ago. Honestly, I'm sure we'll get into this. I think that me getting called back was kind of a fluke. It happened under circumstances where I thought, well, that was fun while it lasted. I guess it's all over now. And then sure enough, they ended up calling me back. For a while, I tracked how often I appeared. And I think about a year ago, I realized that I've been called over 200 times in about a 2-year time period. What I find interesting is it wasn't until around that 200 mark, I really started to feel like I was myself on there. So I can't wait to share what I learned. At this point, it's probably been somewhere between 250 and 300. I don't obsess as much about keeping track of them simply because I'm not monitoring specifically how I'm doing overall in terms of my communication anymore. But you know me, I tend to obsess about metrics, Christine. I always want to get better. And so up to that first 200, I definitely obsessed about how I was doing. And my wife gave me letter grades. It took a very long time for me to start getting A+, but I stopped counting when I started getting them consistently.
That's amazing. And I have much less experience than the two of you, but the perspective that I have is informed by the work I did early in my career. Before I started Spoken with Authority, I spent 5 years on Capitol Hill. I spent 2 years on the Senate side, working in the communications office for a senator, and then 3 years on the House side, working for a House member as a communications director. But while I had many responsibilities, one of the key things as a communications director and as a press aide is to help with the coordination of and execution of media interviews for the members who I was working for. So that is something that gave me a little bit of insight into the worlds that both David and Lynne are so much more entrenched in. Now, as we get started, I think one of the most important places to start when we are discussing with our clients, or when you listening here are thinking about whether or not to engage in a media interview, whether it's print, radio, TV, podcasts, other platforms, when you decide to engage, and you get an invite, the question is, should I do this or should I not do this? And we've all heard that all news is good news, but I definitely did not ascribe to that when I worked on Capitol Hill. Lynne and David, how should our clients decide when to engage or not?
You want to start, Lynne?
Okay, sure. I think the first thing is whether you actually have something to contribute. You have something that you really want to say, as opposed to just for the opportunity to have your face on the camera. In this day and age, you can do that so easily. You can be on TikTok and you can be on camera. So let's hope that there's something more motivating you than that. If someone approaches you for what Christine called earned media, then they are reaching out to you because somehow or another they think that you might have something to add to other people's understanding, whether it is because you are involved specifically, personally, or your organization is involved in something, or you have a rich background in an area of expertise. So think about that first. If they simply say, I want to know if I can get your thoughts on a couple of things, what things? Think about that. Think about whether or not it is worth your while, whether it's actually worth your time to spend that time talking to that person. Maybe you both would be better served for them to find somebody who's more specifically involved in what they're interested in.
That is a loaded question, Christine, and I think I mean that in a good way. I say I think because let me start off just by being real. I live with the constant awareness that all I have to do is say something that's just a little funny and a little stupid, and it will go viral and erase any other halfway intelligent thing that I've ever said. And I'll almost put it in terms of the types of interviews you can be asked to do. And for these purposes, I would say it's print, then radio, then TV. Maybe TV is actually off the screen. I think it's an unforgiving world these days in that one simple video can go viral and it can make you or break you. And the reality is you have to keep that in mind if you're going to be doing any type of an interview with a journalist. Now, by the time I started getting called to do these interviews, I had really, really practiced and worked hard at doing my communication, making it better, talked to audiences in front of thousands and hundreds of people on more than one occasion. I still found the TV to be nerve-wracking because I'm sitting here thinking, oh my gosh, I'm on national television and you can make a mistake. All those reasons are reasons why, when you start off doing this, to only engage with respected journalists who are part of established organizations who you know are not just going to try to burn you. Washington Post, New York Times, MSNBC, they're not going to just try to make you look stupid. There are news organizations out there with some journalists that I think would do that for the shock value of viewers, and you don't want them building their viewership at your expense, which is what can happen. And so I think one of the key things, in addition to what Lynne is saying, make sure that you're qualified to be talking, but also make sure you're talking to someone who's interested in presenting information in a healthy way and not potentially at your own expense.
Oh, David, that is such an important point, is to do your due diligence and to ask the questions. When I worked on the Hill, one of the litmus tests for us was, is the possibility for us portraying our member as a problem solver in this situation greater than some other outcome? And if the answer was no, then it was generally a not high priority to respond, or not an interview that we would engage in. And oftentimes on the Hill, you would get questions about scandals and issues that were going on. And my member talking about responding to a scandal that was involving another member, there's very little upside to that. Unless there's some way that they are actively being constructive and coming up with a solution, you have to look at what is the potential upside, what is the potential downside. And if there's not a lot of potential upside, for us, it was a pretty easy answer of thanks, but we're not available to do the interview.
What? Okay, I'm sorry, you're breaking up.
I can't hear you. Exactly. This is with the oh, sorry, we're out of pocket during your deadline. There's a long flight today. So the next question I wanted to ask you all, David, let's start with you, is what you just mentioned. You definitely need to do research on the publication, on the journalist, on the perspectives that they have, the history that they've had on this topic, or just generally as a journalist. What other questions do you need to ask the journalist? What other research do you conduct before you agree to an interview and take that next step into getting involved?
Christine, it depends on the type of interview. And I say that because if someone is calling for a print publication, I've noticed the journalist normally calls you directly. If you're being called for an interview on television, normally a booker or some type of a handler is calling you directly, and you're not going to speak to the host until you're actually on air. That matters because of how you're going to be gathering information. And I'm going to tell you what a really nice journalist told me. I asked once, hey, are we off the record? And the journalist said, I'm happy to answer your questions, but please let me just give you a piece of advice. Understand that anytime you're talking to a journalist, you're always on the record. There's no off the record. It's like when trial lawyers say, you know what, scratch that. The record now says, you know what, scratch that. There's no off the record, right? And so with that in mind, I think that we forget that journalists are human. And I find that oftentimes they're actually nice people if you speak to them kindly and respectfully. People have a tendency to get defensive, which in turn makes them get kind of defensive with you. But if you just say, honestly, you know what, I want to do a good job, and therefore I'd like to give some thought to what you plan to ask me about. Can you tell me which direction you're looking to go with your story? That way I can tell you whether or not I can really help you. And I can also be prepared for important questions that I know that your readership is going to be interested in. No one's ever going to say, no, I don't want you to contribute positively to my article, right? They're going to respond to that in kind. And then when it comes to something we're going to be on air, you can simply ask the person who's reaching out to you, can you tell me what you intend to cover? Because surprisingly, they don't always give you a lot of detail. They're calling you because they think you're an expert. So if you ask me about any given trial, there may be 10 different topics I can think of that you might want to cover. And they're just going to say, yeah, I want to talk to you about the Kyle Rittenhouse trial. You have to ask, is there a particular aspect that you plan to be covering so that I can get ready? The last thing to keep in mind is the personality of the person who's actually going to be conducting the interview, because I found that the better I do, the more questions I get asked that I wasn't necessarily expecting. One of the hosts likes to ask, all right, pretend you're former President Trump's lawyer right now. What do you say? And I'm thinking, I didn't trade cue cards for that. So you've got to have a sense of what you might be stepping into. And if you can manage that in the context of being yourself and remind yourself, that's why they called you to be you, then you can balance those factors well when the interview is actually in progress.
Great point, David, about especially those fast turnaround radio and TV where there's a constant news cycle and you're invited, especially for an on-air interview or something that's going to be on air soon. They may ask you about breaking news that you didn't know about when you agreed to do the interview a couple of days ago or a week ago. And so keeping up on current events, keeping an eye on what's going on with the news as you're preparing for that interview is really important. Really great advice. Lynne, what else would you add? And can you talk about some of the logistical details that people should ask about when they are going to engage, especially in a TV or some sort of broadcasted interview?
Well, there's a lot. There are a lot of different parts of this. First of all, I think you want to be intentional about what it is that you think you want to share. And you can be more intentional about that by getting more specific information about what the topic is. You and the person who is doing the interview with you may have separate agenda. You probably have separate agenda. And you should be aware of what their agenda is and also what the audience is to whom they're delivering. Whether it is a specific primetime television show or it is a minute 45 segment on evening news or something like that, and they're asking you for a soundbite, which everyone thinks they know how that works now. But it may just be just that little bit of something that they're looking for to fill out the piece. You want to know what it is that they're looking for. You also have to be aware, as David said, journalists and people asking these questions, whether it's the booker or it's the person doing the pre-interview, because the correspondent themselves is running around like crazy getting other pieces of information. They don't always know. Sometimes they really are asking you because they don't know what they're talking about. And they are going to you to get that information. Or still, they may think they know what they're talking about. And then you realize in the questions that you're being asked that that's not quite it. Let me give you a little extra background. That's harder to do in a live interview, the type that David does so much. It is a recorded interview. You might be able to take another minute or so to make sure that we're clear about what is being asked or not being asked, or to say that isn't really our area of expertise. So I'm going to pass on that particular question. There are different ways that you can control that. And in terms of preparing for like an on-camera interview as opposed to a print interview or a radio recorded interview, you want to make sure that you know that you are camera ready. You want to take out your cell phone and turn it to selfie and make sure that this is going to pass muster with your mom or somebody, some other loved one who's going to see you on air. Just so that you're more comfortable.
Really great advice. And I think it is important for our listeners who may be new to responding to media requests that when you're asking about the format, to be really clear, is this going to be in studio? So for example, that would mean that you would go to, so sometimes David flies to DC to be in studio with other guests so that they can have an in-person dialogue. It might be a remote studio where David is in one box, another guest is another box, and then the host of the show is separate from them both. Those are important distinctions. And then Lynne, you brought up the idea of recorded, live, and then there's live to tape. So for example, a recorded interview, if you know it's recorded and you start off a sentence in a way that you didn't really love or the explanation was long, you could say, gosh, I didn't love that. Let me take another go at it. And they can cut it, edit it, and use it. If it is live to tape, it is not live. It's not being broadcast live, but they're intending to take the entire segment that you do with the interviewer and put it on the air, which means that there are no do-overs, even though that portion is recorded. Then obviously you need to know if you're on live TV, because that's one where you have to be especially aware. To David's point, there are definitely no do-overs, and any flub or mistake has
I've done all of those
viral.
So I can relate to what you're saying.
Yes. So some of the other questions, and if you do lots of media interviews, we had our own checklist for print questions. Who will be, connecting the interview? Usually it's the person who's calling, making sure, getting a sense of what the deadline is for the piece. When do they believe that it would be published? When we were doing radio, similar, are there other guests that will be on? Is it live? Is it live to tape? Is it going to be in the studio? Do you want me to do it with a telephone? Do you want to do it by Zoom? What format are we going to use? How can I improve the sound quality? For TV, asking also about other guests, so you have an understanding, and just understanding how you will engage with the other guests, because sometimes they're around the same table, sometimes you're in different uplinks and you can't see them at all. You can't even see the host. You're just looking into a camera and responding somewhat in a vacuum. So it's really important to ask all those questions and to have a really clear list of all of the information that you need. Yes,
you just made me think about something I totally forgot. And this is something that I do regardless of where I'm speaking. And it's also true when I'm doing my lawyer thing. Everyone overlooks the people that actually makes the program happen. Like people overlook the camera person. People overlook the photographer when they come by. You can ask them questions and they're actually really, really nice. And they appreciate being asked. And so when I've done interviews in person or even over Zoom, I'll ask the person who checks you in, because normally someone checks you in for video and then normally someone checks you in for sound. I'll just ask, hey, I really want to make sure that my background looks good because I want to contribute positively to the show. What could I do better? They'll give you specific recommendations for lighting. They'll give you specific recommendations for microphones. I had one who gave me specific recommendations for what stand to purchase for my ring light, depending on which one I got. They helped me adjust things in my office. They'll tell you how to do well. And then it doesn't just apply to that one setting. It applies to your next Zoom call and in other contexts. You can also tell people that, because my favorite thing that anyone has ever told me, I thought that this was like one of the best compliments ever. They booked me for one show. And then the person who did the booking said, David, I just told people that I booked you, and everybody's like, oh, David's great. Like, I love David. He's so nice. I found that when people perceive you that way, they will help you because they want to see you do well. So don't forget that in the midst of all this stuff that seems confusing and intimidating, if you're just polite and respectful to everyone, they'll help find ways to make sure you're successful in that one interview and the next few. But it's easy to forget that when you start getting nervous. And
I think it's the same advice that when you're going in to talk to the head honcho at an organization, that's probably a really terrible term. Let me try that again. Someone who's in a leadership role, that being kind to their administrative staff at the organization is a great way to learn information and to get unexpected support, ways you could never anticipate. And it's the same thing when you're going to media interviews. So I think that's really great advice. Now, a lot of times people think of media interviews as one thing and public speaking and presentation skills as another. I think there's a lot more overlap of those Venn diagrams. Talk a little bit about how people can use their background in public speaking and presentation to prepare the content for interviews. How is it like public speaking? How is it different?
I'd say that I come back to the idea of intention and to be succinct. You don't need to give a whole long story about anything, especially if they've called you, if they contacted you about a specific thing. Speak to that and don't volunteer more. Give succinct, decisive answers. And if they want to know more, they will ask more. But you don't want to get into the weeds somewhere or necessarily get into trouble where you've said more than you need to. It is what David was saying before, because we all can be just this far from saying too much. And then that's the thing that people remember.
And that's
thing that
always
goes
the
viral.
thing that goes in the paper, that gets cut for the radio, that goes on TV. The minute that you stray off of your key messaging, it's like, oh, I know that's going to be the thing that they use. Yeah, great advice, Lynn.
And also the idea that you may not know. They may ask you something that you don't know. Never make it up. Never lie. Do not try to finesse your way out of it. If you don't know, you don't know. You can say you don't know, or let me get back to you. Again, especially if it's a print or recorded interview, you can suggest to the person interviewing you, I don't have that in front of me. I can get back to you. What's your deadline? I can send you an email and give you a little bit more information so that it has more context. You can do those things. Just be real.
You know, Christine, this is another loaded question because so much goes into it. And I spend a lot of time trying to prepare for each individual interview because I really like doing it and I would like to be called more. It's hard for me to think through what the most important thing to keep in mind is when you're preparing, but I think I'm going to boil it down to saying that the objective is to get quoted. Let me say why I say that. Sometimes I'm called for thought leadership. Sometimes I'm called for a specific case that I'm working on. My wife also gets called. She's a physician scientist, and sometimes she's offering medical information, for example, how to protect yourself during the COVID pandemic. And we have other colleagues who will sometimes appear on, especially NPR, to talk about either the pandemic or some other public health issue. But it doesn't matter what the context is. What you want is for them to be able to take your information in a bite-sized piece that you are comfortable being repeated and repeat that information. In print, that's going to be some form of a quote. If it's over radio or over TV, it's going to be a video or snippet that they may release and be playing again. You want to make sure that that's something that you can live with. And so there are several things you have to do to ensure that happens. First, you have to think of how to best summarize the totality of whatever it is you're talking about. And my current guideline is you have to be able to do that at a 10th grade reading level. And then you have to be able to flesh that out in a way that's meaningful over the course of about 2 minutes. I'm going to give an example from something I didn't think I was going to be able to talk about necessarily when they first called. They were asking about Britney Spears' conservatorship. And I'm thinking, how much do I really know about conservatorships in California? And took me to another point that I forgot. You have to stop and ask yourself why they would be calling you. And before you say no, if you need to say no, you say no. Think through how it might be applicable to something that you do. I'm Gen X. I love Britney Spears as much as anybody else. Didn't see how it was a civil rights issue. But then I looked up and figured out that the ACLU and 30 nonprofits wrote a brief supporting her ability and the ability of anyone in a conservatorship to choose their own attorney. But I've got this issue with the conservatorship. I've got her court-appointed lawyer. I've got her dad. I've got the way that her money's being managed. It's a lot to talk about. And the basic question is going to be, how do you summarize all this? And I finally figured out, you know what? My mom would be very upset with me saying this on the air on national television, but here's how it works, Shep. When you turn on the light in the South at night, all the bugs scatter. And that's exactly what's happening here. And then from there, I can kind of flesh it out. But you have to have some way of introducing the topic like very, very briefly, What happens is we get so bogged down in the weeds once you start preparing that you forget that part of the medium is to explain things to people who don't necessarily know what's going on succinctly and in a way where people want to tune in and watch or read more.
I completely agree on the metaphors and analogies. One of my members in particular had so many analogies he would use, or old saws, that's the camel's nose under the tent. And a lot of them, I came from a different part of the country. I was not familiar with many of them, but they're really,
what does that one mean?
Right, exactly. Right. It's like a slippery slope, right? If the camel's nose is under the tent, the camel's coming in. This is the idea.
Got you.
And one of the great things about metaphors or analogies, it gets people's attention, it gives them some understanding, but the understanding is also a little bit fuzzy. It's not 100% concrete because you're using an analogy. So it does give you a little bit of wiggle room in terms of meaning and how you can explain it. So there is a lot of value there. One of the things that, David, I know that you do for the questions that you anticipate getting in an interview is you use our sandwich structure tool that we use for formal presentations and for people to give an update in a meeting that's short and brief. Yeah. Tell us about how that works.
I always use the sandwich method. And I'd say it this way, basically. One, the things that I end up saying that people like, I normally didn't plan to say. What happens is I use a sandwich structure and I write down my thoughts overall. Then when I start practicing out loud how to break these things down, then I start to come up with things that people like to either repeat or replay. But it starts off with me basically asking, all right, what are they asking me about overall? And how would I summarize the totality of what's going on with this topic right now? And then I go through creating 3 different blocks. I wish I had one here in front of me. And I'll ask myself, if I only get the chance to say one thing, what's the most important thing to say? Second thing, what's the most important thing to say? Third thing, what's the most important thing to say? Let me tell you why that's important. On these news shows, they do not tell you what questions they're going to ask you. I've only been on 2 shows where they'll actually call and talk through what they're going to ask you. The Today Show did with me, and then Meet the Press did. They actually talked through the questions, potential responses. The rest of the shows, it's live and you get the questions as they come to you. Here's why it's important to point that out. I think that the first response I give, it's a balance between what I planned to say and what I was asked. And sometimes I have to adjust that. Thinking through the sandwich structure and the critical questions that I know are going to come up helps me to anticipate where I need to be in terms of what I'm likely going to have to say. A critical component of this is after the interview, I go back and ask myself, how well did I anticipate what was going to come up? And if I didn't think through something that was going to come up, I ask myself, okay, honestly, shouldn't I have been able to tell that that was going to come up? The answer is normally yes. And I think that's important because it is an important part of speaking impromptu and off the cuff. You have to be able to anticipate and prepare for what the question is going to be. The last part of the sandwich structure, and it's in the book, so look the book up, but there's one key part that I change, and that is the summary at the bottom of the structure. Mine does not say summary. I call it like my mic drop moment. I have way too many hip hop analogies, But the producers will give you a heads up. They'll say, hey, if you hear, that means I need you to wrap it up in 30 seconds or less. You've got to be ready to do that. Now, that sounds like the only challenge is brevity, and it is not. It's also a challenge with you being who you're comfortable being on the air. And I'm going to give a quick example. I got called to provide counter analysis with regard to Bill Cosby's conviction being overturned. And I'm just going to be real and say it straight up. I'm not interested in defending a serial sex offender. I'm not interested. And so if you're going to take a couple of lines from what I say, and it may sound like I'm defending him, I'm not okay with that. And so part of what I had to think through is, depending where we are in the conversation, if I have to wrap up really quickly, what can I say that balances out anything I've already been offering in terms of counter analysis, but that I'm comfortable representing me on the air? And that is something you cannot think through on the spot. You have to be prepared for that in advance, even if it's going to be through a brief closeout.
David, I appreciate you preempting my next question, which is about rehearsal, because you told us about how you anticipate, how you rehearse out loud, and then how you watch and reflect on the experience so that you can improve for the next time. Those are practices that every individual who responds to media requests should do, every public speaker should do, everyone who goes and speaks in meetings or networking events should be doing. Thank you so much for walking through that. what are some of the common mistakes that people make in terms of their delivery? And Lynne, you already gave us one, which was they rely on others to tell them that they look and sound good. Both of you have touched on that. That's a big one. You have to rely on yourself. You need to ask others and get input as much as you can, but to really make sure that your image, your sound is coming across in the professional way that you want it to. What are other common mistakes in the way that people comport themselves in responding to questions for interviews? What would you give as advice?
Well, certainly the way that we work with our clients in terms of other types of presentation deal with the idea of not just being succinct, but making sure that you're talking in a declarative sentence, no upspeak. Even if you have not figured out what else you want to say, at least let your voice settle so that you don't sound uncertain. If you're trying to figure out how to get to the next thing, use the silence, pause, and then go on to the next thing. That's very important. Circling back to something else that David said about our sandwich structure is that with the sandwich structure in introduction and in the close, you might use something that is almost like a cliche or idiomatic English to get people's attention. And idiom is important, especially in broadcasting, because it catches people's attention. And most people know what you're talking about if you make some reference to some sort of situation that, or some sort of even slang cliche that you use. It saves time. It saves time and helps you get to the next thing. And then, as David said, you want to be strong. You want to have that mic drop moment. You want to know how you want to close this out. And even if you're getting that 15 seconds left, you want to be thinking about how I get to that point. How do I get to that last thing that I want to leave them with about me on this topic? That's important to be, again, intentional. Think about what it is you want to say and then how you say it.
Thanks, Lynne. Yeah, and it's important to think about the differences in format. If you are on a broadcast TV interview, you do not have 2 minutes to explain anything at one go. It is much, much shorter. Lynne, what do you think is an ideal length of response? 20 seconds, 15 seconds, 10 seconds?
It depends on the question. I really hate to limit it and make it so specific like that, because if you are editing yourself and you know there's more to say, you want to be clear. You want context. The reason they're calling you is because they thought that you were going to say something that people will understand. And if you need a little bit more time, take up that time. But at the same time, you don't want to howdy and, well, see, Christine, that's such a good question. Thank you for saying that. Oh.
That's my pet peeve. That's a good question. Never say that on a live or recorded interview.
But of course, a lot of times when people do that, when they say that's a good question, it is the additional time they're building in to come up with an answer. They're eating up time in a way to make it seem like, oh God, I'm not floundering here. That's a good question. That's a very good question. Let me see. People will do that. And I guess that if they need to do that, they need to do that. But you should be better prepared. You should know what it is that you want to say, what you think you have to offer. And if necessary, sort of, again, building off of what David said, if somebody is trying to lead you down a rabbit hole that you don't belong in, you have to pull back. You have to close it. No, that is not what I would say on that topic. I would say that we do this, this, and this.
Great advice. Yeah, great advice. Take control. David, what are your pet peeves? What's your advice on delivery?
I'm going to skip over things that always factor in. Like, for example, your setup, you have to think through what your setup is going to be in advance. You have to think through your appearance in terms of how you're dressing. There are little things like pulling your jacket down before you sit down that I've learned over time. Skipping past those things, when I look back at my first few interviews, Christine, they were largely like this in terms of how I would present. I would just feel like I had to stay very solid the entire time when I was talking. I didn't really feel comfortable smiling, and I felt like everything had to feel very, very scripted. It took me a long time to just relax and be myself. You have to know what your style is, little things that help. For example, I fidget fidget all the time. When I first started doing them, I would keep one of these heart-shaped stones that my wife and I bought when we were in Africa in her hometown. I'd have it outside the screen, and I'm squeezing it as though my life depends on it, but you can't tell. I had to get a chair where I couldn't roll around and move. And then, so at first I had to keep myself stationary, but what I had to do is watch myself on video to get a sense of when I was actually being me in a way that I'm comfortable with. You all both know me. I'm not like the straight man. I'm not the person who can just come and just give you straight facts and then that's it and that's the end of it. Like, I tell stories, I smile, I like to laugh, even though the subject matter that I'm dealing with is very, very serious, and you got to keep that in mind. I had to give myself permission to be myself, and part of that included recognizing that I may not get called back. I told my wife, they're calling me about civil rights issues. I want to be real in terms of how I feel. I have to balance that. Obviously, I can't say anything too crazy, but I remember I was asked about George Floyd during Derek Chauvin's trial and why they wanted to show his prior arrest video from 2019. And my answer is, what you have to understand is, conservative jurors get very nervous when you're talking about drug use. And that's especially true when the alleged drug user is big and Black. And I thought, I need to say it like that. Does that make some people feel uncomfortable? Sure. Is it uncomfortable enough to where I run the risk that maybe I don't get called back? 100%. But the best interview that I gave, where I think it led to me getting more callbacks at the same time to counterbalance this, was one where I didn't understand how famous the person I was talking to was, because I don't always know who famous people are. So I didn't know. So I got called and I was asked, we give this interview, and I was like, at the end of the day, I'm tired. Yeah, why not? I just said, I'm just going to be myself. And that happened. And there was one time I was asked a question and I gave a straight answer. And then the person after me gave a waffling answer. And I was like, oh my gosh, maybe I was supposed to waffle. Well, I guess I answered it. I have to live with whatever happens. And it turned out to be meaningful. But I look back and I tell myself, it's the exact same thing with impromptu conversations. And I get this question, especially from young partners at large law firms. And that is, you don't want to take the risk of being correct. Are there times when you might need to qualify? Yes. Are there times when you might need to add in some nuance? Yes. But oftentimes we second guess ourselves for no reason other than we're not comfortable just giving the answer straight. And you have to give yourself permission to do that and take risks and be yourself. And if you do that and you're successful, I think you'll like the terms much more better than if you're constantly worried about how every word sounds and whether or not it's something someone wants to hear as opposed to being what you want to say.
Right. And as a thought leader, if you want to get invited back for interviews, you have to have a grounded, clear perspective. If you're waffling on answers, why would someone call you back for your perspective? That is part of what thought leadership is. It's about being thoughtful and planning it through and avoiding the negative viral moment. But also, you're right, taking risks, thinking about what the perspective is and pushing the envelope a little bit, because that makes it more newsworthy. Now, we talked a little bit about my final question for you both, which is, what do you do after an interview? So when it is something that is a performance that is recorded, watch, listen, analyze how it went, identify how it could be improved. Same thing with print. What actually made it in? How could I have better anticipated that in my preparation so that you're learning what is tickling the ears of the journalists and getting into the final edited piece, whether that's print, radio, or TV. What are other things you think folks should do after the interview is over, in addition to reviewing and reflecting and having that feedback loop?
I think you want to make sure that you have seen the final product. Even if the final product is going to be down the line, like I said, for a number of print interviews or different publications, their lead time may be pretty long. Or even if they're doing an interview on a big topic, you can do an on-camera interview, but it won't go to air for some time. So you want to keep track of that. You want to have a calendar where you're keeping track of that. You want to make sure when you look at it that that person represented you fairly. What happened if they didn't? Is it something that you were ambiguous about, or did they somehow break that unwritten contract that you had when you agree to do an interview with someone, that they're going to be fair and that you're going to be fair too? You want to follow up with that. If it is a good interview and it is in good places, then you want to take that interview and make sure that other people are aware of it. Whether or not anybody else asks you back ever again, If it's good, it's good. Let other people know about it.
Absolutely, Lynn. I could not have provided better advice. You're amazing. Such great advice. Use social media to share it. Use your organization's newsletter to share it. Earned media is really helpful because when it goes well, you have then the stamp of being a thought leader and being someone that this trusted, respected journalist went to get that perspective. So you should absolutely send it widely. And Lynn, one thing that you mentioned about reading it and asking if it was fair, when something would come out and it was a really great piece and it was fair to the person that I was representing on the Hill and others, I would write back and say, wow, that was a really great piece. Thank you so much for including us in it. Great job. I really love this part of it. So giving that feedback. And if you thought that you did not get a fair shake, sometimes if you have a long-term collegial relationship, you can rib the person like, wow, interested to see that this is what made it in, like, oh, haha. Or to demand a correction if you know that you were misled in a way that was really important. And corrections, most people don't read them or see them, but it does go in the record when people look it up later, there will be a correction. And if you feel that it is vitally important for your reputation or the organization to get that corrected and there was a mistake, I do think it is in some cases worth really pushing for a correction. That's a really rare occasion, but it does happen. Mistakes can be made. David, what other after the fact things do you do?
So these days, most of the time, my press hits are live on MSNBC. So immediately after, you'd see a scene, something like this. Pull out my cell phone. Hey, love, did you see it? Did you see it?
Mm-hmm.
How'd I look? I get an A+? Yes, like that. At this point, like something like that. And I know when I get home, Josephine's going to make me watch the video, which is physically painful. And then at first, I would focus mainly on my delivery because I wasn't myself for whatever reason. I just wasn't. And I think it's because this is so unfamiliar for me when I'm talking over Zoom versus when I'm in person. In person is a lot more natural for me. But once I got past the delivery, the question I ask myself most of the time is that the way I want to come across on this issue? I should think of it purely in terms of dollars and cents. My mind just doesn't really work that way. I think more through the fact that I care about this topic. Did I represent this topic the way that I wanted to? And I feel like I noticed that even more when it's in print. I was asked recently about domestic violence survivors and how much prosecutors should take into consideration what they want when deciding to move forward. And I just found myself thinking back to when I was working on those cases as a prosecutor. And I feel like there's a lot of really critical information that I want to be represented the correct way because it influences how we think about these topics. Sexual assault is another topic. We throw that around sometimes, or sometimes I feel like I need to point out, hey, what we're defining as a sexual assault here, what you should understand in states like Texas, it's not even against the law. It's treated the same way that a traffic ticket is. Because I think that information is important for people to know so that we can push for the types of social change that are necessary. So that's normally what I do. I'll watch the video or I'll read the article. I'll think through whether or not I feel like it best represents what I wanted to say. And if it doesn't, I'll immediately think of how I might say it better. And I've never had to challenge a journalist yet about something they did that I thought was unfair. But I have sometimes followed up and said, hey, I just realized there's some additional thoughts I have. Because a lot of these stories are going to come up again. They're going to call you again. It's meaningful for them to know you've got more to say. And then fortunately, what's also happened for me is that oftentimes I've branched out and been able to volunteer thoughts on other subjects I didn't anticipate. That was the thing that I actually did not expect. A lot of the journalists have been remarkably nice, and the other contributors have just been super, super kind. Then they'll also give you additional information about how you can improve, and you can learn from their collective experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Asking for the feedback is always great, both from your own circles and networks, but from the people who you talk to, because some of them are, if you have that rapport with them, some of them will be helpful to help you out. And I do love that idea of staying in touch with a journalist, because if there's a journalist who's expressed an interest in a certain topic that is an ongoing concern, David, you know, police brutality, as much as you and I would like it to end today and never happen again, it is unfortunately going to happen in the United States in coming days and weeks, would be my guess, sadly. And by continuing to stay in touch with people keeps you top of mind. If you have further thoughts, that means that you might get the call for the next interview opportunity. So it's a really great idea to keep those people working with you. And I remember, Lynne, when we were talking before we started recording, you said, I really don't, when people send me stuff unsolicited, I don't, it is generally a sign that it's not going to be something that I want to cover. The fact is, though, if you already have a relationship with a journalist who has done work on a topic and has talked to you before, sending them a quick note to say, hey, I don't know if you saw this development. Here's what happened. Let me know if I can help you with it. And to be a trusted resource for that journalist really helps you get future opportunities to be interviewed.
I was going to, that's exactly what I was going to say about maintain the rapport, maintain the relationship. Even if it's just that I saw what you did, I watched your work for those things that are not live. But even afterwards, I remember that you mentioned when we were preparing for the interview for the live hit, you mentioned blah, blah, blah. And I just saw this, just send you a quick email about this, might be interesting to you, so that you show that you're paying attention, because ultimately these are about interpersonal relationships. And I like to think that the majority of journalists are nice people. We're pretty nice. And that we want to share information. We want more information and keep adding to our store of knowledge that we can share with other people to make our work better. So when you hit back with someone, an email back, thanks a lot, that went well, or here's one other thing to think about, or even if it's almost a week later or something like this, I just read this, and this may not be what you're working on anymore, but I thought you would like to know, because that's showing that you paid attention to them in the same way that you're hoping that they paid attention to you, instead of just scratching you off the list and going on to the next thing.
Absolutely. And it's one of the reasons why before you do an interview, you should research the journalist. And if you note that they've written on the topic or received an award, that's part of the banter and rapport when you first meet them, if it's a first introduction. No, this has been such an incredible mini course on media for anyone in the spoken with authority community, all of our clients, anyone who is working on responding to that request for an interview. David and Lynne, I cannot thank you enough for your expertise. And I want to encourage anyone who's watching who does come up with that situation of getting an invite for an interview, who would like some support, to reach out, because David and Lynne are both coaches with Spoken with Authority, and we would love to support you on your journey as a leader, which oftentimes includes interacting with journalists. And we can help you do it in a way that will help you elevate your presence, expand your influence, and help you and your organization reach its goals. Thank you so much for this great discussion. I really appreciate it.